Hi all. Today we are going to discuss the next literary criticism, which is study of poetry, Mathew Arnold. The next topic in the literary criticism. That is what we will be discussing today. So, a study of poetry is a critical essay by Mathew Arnold. In this essay, Arnold criticizes the art of poetry as well as the art of criticism. Arnold believes that the art of poetry is capable of high destinies. It is the art in which the idea itself is the art. He says that we should understand the worth of poetry as it is poetry that shows us a mirror of life. So, science, according to Arnold, is incomplete without poetry, and religion and philosophy will give way to poetry. Arnold terms poetry as a criticism of life, thereby refuting the accusation of Plato, and says that as time goes on, man will continue to find comfort and solace in poetry. Arnold says that when one reads poetry, he tends to estimate whether it is of the best form or not. It happens in three ways: the real estimate, the historic estimate, and the personal estimate. The real estimate is an unbiased viewpoint that takes into account both the historical context and the creative faculty to judge the worth of poetry. But the real estimate is often surpassed by the historic and personal estimate. The historic estimate places the historical context above the value of art itself. The personal estimate, on the other hand, depends on the personal taste, the likes and dislikes of the reader, which affects his judgment of poetry. Arnold says that both these estimates tend to be fallacious. The historic and personal estimate often overshadows the real estimate. But Arnold also says that is natural. The study of historical background of poetry and its development often leads to the critic skipping over the shortcomings because of its historical significance. Historic estimate raises poetry to a high pedestal and thus hinders one from noticing its weakness. It is a historic estimate that leads to the creation of classics and raises the poet to a nearly god-like standard. Arnold says that if the poet is truly a classic, his poetry will give the reader the real pleasure and enable him to compare and contrast other poetry which are not of the same high standard. This, according to Arnold, is the real estimate of poetry. Thus, Arnold appeals to his readers to read classics with an open eye and not blind to its faults. This will enable one to rate poetry with its proper value. Arnold here speaks about the idea of imitation. He says that whatever one reads or knows keeps on coming back to him. If a poet wants to reach the high standards of the classics, he might consciously or unconsciously imitate them. This is also true for critics who tend to revert to the historic and personal estimate instead of an unbiased real estimate. The historic estimate affects the study of ancient poets, while the personal estimate affects the study of modern or contemporary poets. Arnold proposes the Touchstone Method of analyzing poetry in order to determine whether it is of a high standard or not. He borrows this method from Longinus, who said in his idea of sublime that if a certain example of sublimity can please anyone regardless of habits, taste or age, and can please at all times, then it can be considered as a true example of the sublime. This method was first suggested in England by Addison, who said that he would have a man read classical works which have stood the rest of time and place, and also those modern works which find high price among other contemporaries. If the man fails to find any delight in them, then he would conclude that it is not the author who lacks quality, but the reader who is incapable of discovering them. Arnold applies the Touchstone Method by taking examples from the time-tested classics and comparing them with other poetry to determine whether they possess the high poetic standard of the classics. He says that poems need not resemble or possess any similarity to the touchstones. Once the critic has lodged the touchstones in his mind in order to detect the possession of high poetic quality, he will have the tact of finding it in the other poetry that he compares to the touchstones. Arnold quotes Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton in an attempt to exemplify touchstone poetry. He says that the examples he has quoted are very dissimilar to one another, and they all possess a high poetic quality. He says that a critic need not labor in vain trying to explain the greatness of poetry. He can do by merely pointing at some specimens of the highest poetic quality. Arnold says that the high quality of poetry lies in its matter and its manner. He then goes on by Aristotle's observation and says that the best form of poetry possesses high truth and seriousness that makes up its subject matter, along with the superior diction that marks its manner. Arnold mentions that the true force of this method lies in its application. He therefore urges critics to apply the Touchstone method to analyze and rate poetry. Arnold then speaks about French poetry, which had a tremendous influence on the poetry of England. He differentiates between the poetry of northern France and the poetry of southern France. The poetry of southern France influenced Italian literature, but it is the poetry of northern France that was dominant in Europe in the 12th and 13th century. The poetry came to England with the Anglo-Normans and had a tremendous impact on English poetry. It was the Romance poems of France that was popular during that time. But Arnold says that it did not have any special characteristics and lacked the high truth. Seriousness, and diction of classic poetry, and remains significant only from the historical point of view. Next, Arnold speaks about Chaucer, who was much influenced by French and Italian poetry. Arnold says that Chaucer's poetic importance is the result of the real estimate and not the historic estimate. The superiority of Chaucer's verse lies both in his subject matter and his style. He writes about human life and nature as he sees it. Arnold speaks highly of Chaucer's diction and calls it a liquid diction to emphasize the fluidity in the manner of Chaucer's writings, which he considers to be an irresistible virtue. Arnold, however, says that Chaucer is not a classic. He compares Chaucer to Dante and points out that Chaucer lacks the high seriousness of classics, thereby depriving him of the high honor. Next, Arnold mentions Milton and Shakespeare and credits them as classics, and moves on to speak about Dryden and Pope. According to the historic estimate, Dryden and Pope are not, no doubt, great poets of the 18th century. Arnold observes that Dryden and Pope were better prose writers than poets. The Restoration period faced the necessity of a fit prose with proper imaginative quality, and this is what Dryden and Pope provided. Arnold therefore concludes that they are classics not of poetry but of prose. After Dryden and Pope, Arnold speaks about Gray. Gray did not write much, but what he wrote has high poetic value. Arnold therefore considers Gray to be a classic. Arnold now speaks about Robert Burns in the late 18th century and says that this is the period from which the personal estimate begins to affect the real estimate. Burns, according to Arnold, is a better poet in Scottish than in English. Like Chaucer, Arnold does not consider Burns to be a classic. He says that Burns too lacks the high seriousness which is desired of poetry. He compares Burns to Chaucer and finds that Burns' manner of presentation is deeper than that of Chaucer. According to the real estimate, Burns lacks the high seriousness of the classics, but his poetry nevertheless has truthful substance and style. Then Arnold moves on to speak about Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, but does not pass any judgment on their poetry. Arnold believes that his estimate of these poets will be influenced by his personal passion, as they are so closer to his age than the classics, and also because their writings are of a more personal nature. Finally, Arnold speaks about the self-preservation of the classics. Any amount of good literature will not be able to surpass the supremacy of the classics, as they have already stood the test of time, and people will continue to enjoy them for the ages to come. Arnold says that this is the result of self-preserving nature of humanity. Human nature will remain the same throughout the ages, and those parts of the classics dealing with the subject will remain relevant at all times, and thus preserving themselves from being lost in time. That is how he stopped there. Hope you have understood. Thank you.